The late months of 1966 brought a chilling, relentless wind across the vast, turbulent expanse of the Gulf of Tonkin. The United States Seventh Fleet had officially initiated Operation Sea Dragon, a massive naval interdiction campaign designed to completely sever the enemy logistics network. Captain William Sterling stood firmly on the cold steel bridge of his guided missile destroyer, staring intently at the gray, unforgiving horizon. His highly disciplined Royal Australian Navy crew was actively preparing to join the massive American armada in a highly dangerous, incredibly demanding maritime theater of brutal, continuous warfare. The primary strategic objective of this unprecedented Allied naval operation was strictly focused on destroying the heavily camouflaged coastal supply lines. Small, highly maneuverable, waterborne logistic craft were constantly ferrying vital ammunition and heavy military equipment southward under the protective cover of darkness. Sterling intricately understood that effectively intercepting these elusive, highly decentralized maritime convoys required absolute precision, immense patience, and overwhelming firepower. The sleek Australian warship was actively transitioning from a purely defensive escort vessel into a highly aggressive, heavily armed maritime hunter preparing to aggressively prowl the incredibly dangerous, deeply contested coastal waters. Leaving the heavily secured, deeply peaceful confines of their designated safe harbor, the Australian crew commenced rigorous combat readiness drills. The massive, twin 5-inch gun mounts located on the forward deck rotated with a menacing, deeply mechanical growl during the intensive targeting simulations. Highly trained gunners meticulously checked their heavy ammunition hoists, strictly ensuring that the highly volatile explosive shells would flow completely seamlessly during a chaotic firefight. Deep within the heavily armored Combat Information Center, specialized radar operators aggressively scanned their glowing green screens, actively calibrating the highly sensitive electronic sensors for the upcoming maritime mission. To actively facilitate seamless, highly coordinated tactical communication with the massive American naval armada, a specialized liaison officer was deployed. Major Jack Reyes of the United States Navy confidently stepped onto the pristine, heavily scrubbed deck of the Australian warship. He carried a heavy canvas duffel bag filled with highly classified coastal charts, detailed enemy artillery positions, and deeply encrypted radio frequencies. Sterling firmly shook the American officer's hand, warmly welcoming him to the highly disciplined, tightly knit Allied vessel. "We are deeply honored to actively support the Seventh Fleet in this critical campaign, Major," Sterling stated professionally. Major Reyes immediately began integrating himself deeply into the highly complex operational rhythm of the proud Australian naval crew. He intimately understood the incredibly dangerous nature of Operation Sea Dragon, having previously observed the devastating accuracy of hidden coastal batteries. The American officer spent countless hours in the crowded Combat Information Center, carefully aligning their sophisticated targeting systems with the massive American surveillance grid. "The enemy absolutely utilizes the shallow coastal waters to actively hide their logistical movements from our deep water patrols," Reyes explained calmly, aggressively pointing at a heavily marked, highly classified maritime map. The initial minor cultural differences between the heavily formalized Royal Australian Navy and the highly pragmatic American officer quickly evaporated. The incredibly intense, deeply unified focus on their highly dangerous shared mission forged a powerful, unbreakable bond of mutual professional respect. Sterling admired Reyes's extensive tactical knowledge regarding the heavily fortified enemy coastline, while Reyes completely respected the exceptional seamanship and absolute technical proficiency of the Australian sailors. They were actively uniting two distinct naval traditions to effectively create an incredibly lethal, highly coordinated maritime strike force, perfectly designed to dominate the brutal coastal combat zone. Sailing aggressively into the designated operational sector of the massive Gulf of Tonkin felt like actively entering a heavily primed powder keg. The dense, heavily overcast sky perfectly mirrored the deeply oppressive, incredibly tense atmosphere rapidly building among the highly focused combat crew. The Australian destroyer formally joined a massive, highly intimidating line of American warships, all strictly maintaining complete radio silence as they aggressively prowled the dark, turbulent waters. The sheer, undeniable scale of the massive naval armada actively projecting overwhelming military power across the gray ocean was a profoundly awe-inspiring, deeply terrifying spectacle. The heavily armed Allied fleet was completely tasked with establishing an absolute, highly impenetrable steel blockade right along the heavily defended coastline. This incredibly demanding maritime strategy absolutely required the massive warships to actively operate dangerously close to the hostile, shallow enemy shores. Such highly aggressive positioning inherently exposed the valuable naval vessels to devastating, highly accurate fire from heavily camouflaged coastal artillery batteries deeply hidden within the mountainous terrain. Sterling intricately recognized that they were actively transitioning from being distant, untouchable hunters into highly visible, extremely vulnerable targets participating in a deadly naval duel. Nightfall upon the turbulent, heavily contested waters of the massive Gulf brought a profoundly terrifying, deeply suffocating blanket of absolute darkness. The highly skilled Australian radar operators heavily strained their exhausted eyes, aggressively staring at the glowing circular screens searching for incredibly faint, fleeting contacts. The elusive enemy logistics vessels were constructed entirely of wood and heavily coated in thick mud, actively rendering them practically invisible to standard, highly sophisticated military electronic sensors. Finding these small, highly maneuverable craft actively required a deeply intense, incredibly frustrating combination of raw instinct, extreme patience, and pure tactical luck. To significantly enhance their heavily restricted nocturnal vision, the Allied fleet aggressively utilized highly advanced, heavily armed maritime patrol aircraft flying high above the turbulent ocean. These massive American planes dropped incredibly brilliant, intensely burning parachute flares that violently illuminated the dark, heavily contested coastal waters with a harsh, highly unnatural white glow. Major Reyes stood quietly on the dark bridge, tightly holding a heavily encrypted radio handset directly communicating with the unseen aerial spotters. "We absolutely need a highly accurate, heavily confirmed visual identification before we can actively unleash the main battery," Reyes muttered tensely. A sudden, incredibly sharp metallic crackle from the heavy tactical radio violently broke, the deeply oppressive silence reigning within the dark combat information center. The unseen American spotter aircraft had finally detected a small, highly suspicious cluster of unidentified vessels desperately attempting to quietly slip southward along the jagged, heavily shadowed coastline. Captain Sterling immediately ordered the highly trained Australian helmsman to aggressively alter the massive warship's course, turning the heavy steel bow directly toward the heavily concealed enemy position. The massive, deeply powerful steam turbines roared violently, aggressively driving the heavy destroyer forward through the massive waves. The incredibly heavy, violently churning seas of the massive Gulf of Tonkin presented a severely difficult, highly complex ballistic challenge for the dedicated gunnery officers. The massive Australian warship was pitching violently and heavily rolling in the incredibly dark, deeply turbulent water, actively making highly accurate mechanical targeting exceptionally difficult to properly maintain. The highly skilled weapons officers rapidly calculated the complex firing solutions, desperately attempting to perfectly synchronize the massive, heavy gun turrets with the completely erratic, highly unpredictable movements of the violently bucking steel deck. The immense, deeply stressful technical pressure was absolutely overwhelming. As the heavily armed Australian destroyer rapidly closed the tactical distance, a brilliantly blinding white parachute flare violently ignited directly over the heavily designated coastal target area. The harsh, incredibly intense illumination instantly revealed three heavily loaded, deeply camouflaged wooden supply boats, desperately hugging the jagged, deeply shadowed shoreline. "Target is actively visually confirmed. Massive enemy logistics element detected on the surface," Major Reyes shouted loudly into the chaotic, deeply tense atmosphere of the dark bridge. Captain Sterling aggressively gripped the heavy steel railing, his highly focused eyes completely locked onto the brilliantly illuminated, highly vulnerable targets. "Commence main battery firing immediately. Actively engage the designated surface targets," Sterling commanded with absolute, deeply unquestionable military authority. The massive, highly sophisticated twin 5-inch gun mounts, located on the forward deck, instantly unleashed absolute, terrifying hell upon the dark waters. The incredibly deafening, violent roar of the massive naval cannons aggressively shook the entire heavy steel warship, violently rattling the delicate glass instruments located on the dark bridge. Blinding, incredibly massive yellow muzzle flashes violently illuminated the deeply dark ocean, forcefully hurling heavy, highly explosive projectiles directly toward the terrified, completely exposed enemy logistics crews. The deadly, highly explosive naval artillery shells screamed aggressively through the cold night air, detonating with absolutely terrifying, incredibly massive destructive force just meters away from the fleeing wooden supply boats. Massive, violently towering columns of dark, foaming seawater completely erupted into the illuminated night sky, heavily showering the heavily terrified enemy crews with razor-sharp steel shrapnel. The highly trained Australian gunnery officers meticulously adjusted their complex firing solutions, actively walking the massive, heavily concentrated barrage of highly explosive destruction directly across the highly vulnerable, completely trapped enemy maritime formation with cold, deeply terrifying mechanical precision. One of the massive, highly explosive artillery rounds achieved a completely devastating, highly spectacular direct hit on the incredibly heavily loaded lead logistics vessel. A profoundly massive, violently blinding fireball instantly ripped aggressively through the dark coastal waters as the deeply concealed enemy ammunition cargo catastrophically detonated. The sheer, undeniable concussive shockwave was deeply felt across the heavily armored steel hull of the distant Australian destroyer, violently rattling the incredibly heavy metal doors. The entire wooden boat simply vanished into a massive, highly toxic cloud of burning debris and incredibly thick, deeply dark black smoke. The two surviving enemy logistics craft desperately attempted to violently maneuver through the heavily explosive chaos, actively seeking the incredibly shallow, deeply protective safety of a nearby coastal river mouth. However, the highly focused Australian radar systems remained completely, absolutely locked onto their frantic, highly desperate evasion attempts. The massive naval guns aggressively roared once again, completely filling the dark night air with incredibly massive, deeply deadly salvos of highly explosive steel. Within minutes, the remaining two wooden supply vessels were entirely reduced to heavily splintered, violently burning wreckage slowly sinking into the dark, turbulent ocean. All designated surface targets have been completely neutralized. Absolute brilliant shooting. Gentlemen, Major Reyes announced proudly over the heavily static-filled tactical intercom system. The deeply exhausted Australian bridge crew permitted themselves a highly brief, deeply muted moment of absolute professional satisfaction. They had successfully executed a flawless, incredibly deadly maritime interdiction, actively preventing tons of vital enemy ammunition from reaching the massive, highly destructive land war raging to the distant south. However, Captain Sterling intuitively knew that this highly successful, incredibly brief skirmish was merely the opening act of a massive, heavily brutal maritime campaign. The heavily armed destroyer slowly turned away from the violently burning wreckage, aggressively resuming its highly dangerous patrol along the deeply dark, incredibly hostile coastal waters. The incredibly intense, highly deafening roar of the massive naval guns was quickly replaced by the heavily rhythmic, deeply powerful thrumming of the massive ship's heavy engines. The highly skilled Australian sailors rapidly moved to meticulously clean the heavily smoking gun barrels and aggressively reload the massive ammunition magazines. They inherently understood that the deeply elusive, highly dedicated enemy logistics forces would absolutely attempt another incredibly desperate supply run tomorrow. Major Reyes remained deeply focused on his heavily encrypted radio equipment, actively monitoring the massive, highly complex tactical communication network of the American 7th Fleet. The deeply terrifying, highly destructive reality of Operation Sea Dragon was rapidly escalating far beyond merely hunting small, incredibly vulnerable wooden supply boats in the dark. The massive Allied Naval Command was actively preparing to heavily authorize highly aggressive, incredibly dangerous shore bombardment missions against deeply fortified enemy coastal military installations. Captain, we are officially receiving massive new targeting coordinates for heavy coastal artillery suppression strikes, Reyes announced with profound gravity. This highly significant, incredibly dangerous shift in operational strategy meant the heavily armed Australian destroyer would actively become a highly visible, highly prioritized target. They would now aggressively engage directly with massive, deeply entrenched enemy artillery batteries actively concealed within the heavily fortified coastal mountains. Captain Sterling deeply understood that successfully executing these incredibly risky shore bombardment missions required an absolute, highly flawless display of advanced naval gunnery and extreme tactical maneuvering. The incredibly deadly, highly explosive maritime game of cat and mouse was rapidly evolving into a massive, deeply terrifying heavyweight naval artillery brawl. The deeply exhausted, highly disciplined Australian crew actively prepared themselves for the massive, incredibly terrifying challenges heavily looming on the dark horizon. The sleek, heavily armored guided missile destroyer aggressively sliced through the incredibly dark, deeply turbulent waters of the massive Gulf of Tonkin, leaving a violently glowing, highly phosphorescent wake behind. They had successfully proven their absolute, undeniable lethal capabilities during the highly chaotic night ambush, completely demonstrating their immense value to the Allied fleet. The incredibly intense, deeply destructive maritime fires of Operation Sea Dragon were only just beginning to violently burn. The pale, miserable light of early dawn slowly crept across the violently churning surface of the massive Gulf of Tonkin. Captain William Sterling stood silently on the heavily armored bridge, watching the incredibly rough, gray waves aggressively battering the steel hull of his destroyer. The deeply unforgiving, highly unpredictable tropical weather was rapidly deteriorating, actively transforming the massive ocean into a deeply chaotic, heavily turbulent battlefield. The highly trained Australian crew intimately understood that successfully hunting small enemy vessels in these extreme conditions would absolutely require immense, deeply unyielding physical endurance. Operation Sea Dragon heavily prioritized the absolute destruction of waterborne logistics craft, commonly referred to as WBLCs by the Allied Naval Command. These incredibly small, heavily camouflaged wooden boats were actively utilized by the enemy to secretly transport massive quantities of vital military supplies southward. They aggressively hugged the deeply shadowed, highly dangerous coastline under the protective cover of absolute darkness, completely blending in with the surrounding natural environment. Sterling deeply realized that effectively intercepting these highly elusive, incredibly resilient maritime supply chains would be an exceptionally frustrating, highly demanding tactical endeavor. To successfully locate these tiny, heavily concealed logistical targets, the Australian warship relied heavily upon deeply integrated, highly complex aerial coordination. Major Jack Reyes maintained constant, highly encrypted radio contact with massive American reconnaissance aircraft aggressively flying high above the thick, dark cloud cover. These highly sophisticated, heavily armed carrier-based planes actively utilized advanced radar systems to meticulously scan the heavily congested coastal waters for any highly suspicious, unapproved maritime movement. The incredibly vital, highly seamless tactical partnership between the powerful American aviation assets and the lethal Australian surface vessel was absolutely essential. However, the notoriously brutal, highly volatile weather patterns of the massive Gulf frequently rendered even the most advanced military technology completely useless. Sudden, incredibly violent tropical squalls aggressively swept across the dark water, instantly reducing tactical visibility to practically zero in a matter of terrifying seconds. The massive steel destroyer pitched and rolled violently in the incredibly heavy, deeply churning seas, actively making highly basic shipboard tasks incredibly difficult and deeply exhausting for the struggling crew. Operating complex, highly sensitive military equipment in this continuously violent, deeply unstable environment was an absolute nightmare. The heavily static-filled tactical radio suddenly crackled with a highly urgent, deeply tense transmission from a distant American spotter plane. "We have actively detected a highly suspected, heavily camouflaged logistics convoy slowly moving southward along the jagged shoreline," Major Reyes loudly relayed to the highly focused bridge crew. Captain Sterling instantly ordered the skilled helmsman to aggressively increase the massive warship's speed, violently driving the heavy steel bow directly into the incredibly rough, towering waves. The deeply thrilling, highly dangerous maritime hunt was aggressively commencing once again in the brutal, dark ocean. The incredibly powerful, deeply massive steam turbines roared with a deafening, highly intense mechanical fury, actively vibrating aggressively through the heavy steel decks of the warship. The highly dedicated Australian engineers meticulously monitored the incredibly complex, heavily pressurized propulsion systems, completely ensuring absolute, maximum tactical speed was actively maintained. They absolutely needed to close the massive maritime distance incredibly fast before the highly elusive, deeply terrified enemy boats could successfully hide within the shallow, heavily protected river estuaries. The incredibly tense, highly desperate race against precious time had officially begun. Deep within the highly claustrophobic, heavily armored Combat Information Center, the skilled Australian radar operators desperately battled against massive, deeply frustrating environmental interference. The incredibly high, violently churning ocean waves actively created thousands of highly confusing, completely false echoes, heavily cluttering their sensitive glowing green screens. This severe, deeply unavoidable technical phenomenon, widely known as sea clutter, actively made it practically impossible to effectively distinguish a small, heavily loaded wooden boat from a massive, naturally occurring ocean swell. The highly sophisticated military sensors were being actively blinded by the brutal, unforgiving sea. Sterling aggressively ordered a highly precise, deeply tactical course change to completely intercept the highly suspected, heavily concealed enemy maritime convoy. Bring us significantly closer to the deeply dangerous, highly shallow coastal waters, but carefully monitor the digital depth sounder, he commanded with absolute, highly firm military authority. Navigating a massive, deeply drafted guided missile destroyer incredibly close to an entirely uncharted, highly hostile enemy shoreline was an exceptionally risky, deeply terrifying tactical maneuver. The deeply looming, highly jagged coastal rocks presented an incredibly massive, entirely deadly navigational hazard in the dark. The highly dedicated visual lookouts stationed firmly on the exposed, violently pitching exterior bridge heavily strained their exhausted, highly bloodshot eyes through heavy binoculars. The deeply pervasive, incredibly thick gray rain and the violently blowing, heavily corrosive sea spray aggressively blurred the dark, shifting horizon. Desperately trying to successfully visually locate a heavily camouflaged, incredibly small wooden vessel in this completely chaotic, deeply miserable weather felt absolutely impossible. It was exactly like aggressively searching for a tiny, completely invisible needle hidden deeply within an incredibly massive, violently churning maritime haystack. The highly coordinated American reconnaissance aircraft aggressively dropped another incredibly brilliant, heavily burning parachute flare directly over the highly suspected enemy coastal position. The massive, intensely hot chemical flare violently struggled to properly ignite within the incredibly heavy, deeply suffocating monsoonal downpour actively battering the dark ocean. When the harsh, incredibly bright white light finally burst open, it aggressively illuminated absolutely nothing but incredibly angry, violently foaming whitecaps rapidly crashing against the jagged rocks. The highly elusive, heavily concealed enemy logistics boats were completely nowhere to be visually found on the surface. The designated target has completely vanished from our sensors, Captain. They probably slipped quickly into a heavily concealed river mouth, Major Reyes stated with a profoundly deep, highly frustrated sigh. The heavily entrenched enemy's incredibly intimate, absolutely flawless knowledge of the highly complex local coastal geography provided an undeniably massive, deeply significant tactical advantage. They aggressively utilized the numerous, highly shallow tidal creeks and deeply hidden, densely vegetated river estuaries to effectively evade the massive, incredibly powerful Allied warships. The highly frustrating, deeply elusive nature of this maritime guerrilla war was becoming incredibly apparent. Captain Sterling completely realized that this massive, heavily armed naval campaign would absolutely not be a rapid, highly straightforward series of easy military victories. The highly resourceful, deeply dedicated enemy forces were incredibly motivated and actively utilized the extremely harsh, completely unforgiving maritime environment perfectly to shield their vital supply lines. Successfully severing these highly resilient, heavily decentralized logistical arteries would actively require an incredibly massive, completely unyielding display of extreme tactical patience and pure physical endurance. The incredibly young, highly disciplined Australian crew was rapidly learning the deeply harsh realities of coastal combat. The heavily frustrated Australian warship slowly returned to its standard, highly methodical patrol pattern along the deeply dangerous, incredibly dark coastal sector. The relentless, completely unavoidable physical toll of actively operating a massive combat vessel in these highly extreme, deeply violent maritime conditions began to heavily show. The incredibly young, deeply exhausted faces of the highly dedicated Australian sailors were tightly drawn with severe, highly profound fatigue and constant, heavily suppressed seasickness. They absolutely refused to completely complain, strictly maintaining their highly professional military discipline despite the overwhelmingly miserable, highly challenging physical environment. Daily shipboard maintenance rapidly became an incredibly constant, deeply grueling, highly desperate battle against the heavily corrosive, highly destructive effects of the tropical saltwater. The highly dedicated gunnery crews meticulously cleaned the massive, heavy 5-inch steel barrels, aggressively scrubbing away the thick, highly damaging salt buildup. They actively needed to completely ensure that the incredibly complex, highly sensitive mechanical firing systems would absolutely never violently jam during a highly critical, deeply dangerous combat engagement. The massive, highly sophisticated warship completely required constant, incredibly intense physical labor simply to effectively remain highly operational. Another deeply oppressive, incredibly terrifying pitch-black night slowly fell over the violently churning, highly contested waters of the massive Gulf of Tonkin. The profound, deeply suffocating darkness actively brought a highly renewed, incredibly intense sense of severe tactical tension to the highly alert bridge crew. The heavily armed Allied hunters intimately knew that the highly elusive, deeply dedicated enemy logistics boats would aggressively utilize the thick protective cover of night to completely move again. The incredibly deadly, highly high-stakes maritime game of deeply terrifying, completely blind hide-and-seek was aggressively resuming immediately. Major Jack Reyes successfully established highly encrypted, deeply secure radio contact with an entirely different, heavily armed American carrier strike group operating nearby. This specific, highly advanced aviation unit was actively equipped with deeply experimental, highly sophisticated infrared thermal imaging sensors mounted on their reconnaissance aircraft. They actively hoped to completely bypass the deeply frustrating visual limitations by aggressively detecting the incredibly faint, completely invisible heat signatures generated by the small boat engines. The highly innovative, deeply advanced military technology actively offered a massively renewed, incredibly vital glimmer of tactical hope. The highly experimental, deeply advanced thermal sensing technology quickly proved to be partially, incredibly effectively successful in the dark, violently churning coastal environment. A deeply faint, highly anomalous thermal heat signature was successfully detected heavily lingering incredibly close to a massive, deeply jagged rocky promontory. The highly heavily armed Australian destroyer immediately altered its tactical course with aggressive, highly violent precision to actively investigate the deeply suspicious, completely unconfirmed thermal contact. The massive, deeply powerful warship aggressively surged forward, heavily crashing violently through the incredibly dark, deeply turbulent, completely freezing ocean waves. The heavily armed, massive steel warship cautiously approached the highly suspicious, deeply jagged coastal coordinates with incredibly extreme, highly disciplined tactical care. They absolutely could not aggressively fire their massive, highly destructive naval guns blindly based solely upon a completely unconfirmed, deeply faint electronic thermal signature. They actively needed to maneuver dangerously close to completely obtain an absolute, highly undeniable visual identification of the deeply concealed target. This highly aggressive, incredibly risky tactical positioning actively exposed the valuable vessel to deeply hidden, completely devastating enemy coastal shore batteries secretly waiting in the darkness. staring intensely through the highly powerful, deeply advanced military night vision optical equipment. A terrifying, highly distinct silhouette slowly began to emerge. "We have an absolutely confirmed, heavily loaded enemy logistics barge, sir, and it is actively hugging the dark rocks incredibly tightly," the highly observant bridge lookout reported urgently. The deeply elusive, highly sought-after maritime target had finally been completely, absolutely cornered against the highly unforgiving, deeply dangerous rocky shoreline. Captain Sterling silently acknowledged the highly critical, deeply vital tactical report, his highly experienced mind rapidly calculating the complex firing instructions. "Commence main battery firing procedures. Aggressively illuminate the designated coastal target first with high-altitude star shells," Captain Sterling ordered with absolute, completely icy calm. The massive, heavily armed forward gun turrets instantly roared, violently hurling brilliant, intensely burning illumination rounds high above the deeply dark, jagged coastal rocks. The terrifyingly bright, completely artificial daylight violently burst open, absolutely exposing the massive, heavily loaded, deeply camouflaged wooden supply barge desperately trying to hide. The incredibly terrifying, highly destructive, utterly violent wrath of the deeply, heavily armed Allied warship was about to be unleashed. The incredibly massive, completely devastating 5-inch naval guns roared to absolute, terrifying life, violently shaking the deeply heavy steel deck beneath their boots. The highly explosive, incredibly deadly first artillery salvo landed just slightly short of the desperately fleeing target, violently sending massive, towering geysers of white water into the air. The highly skilled, deeply focused Australian gunnery officers rapidly adjusted their complex mathematical firing solutions based precisely upon the massive, highly visible splash patterns. The incredibly cold, deeply mechanical, entirely lethal process of absolute maritime destruction was actively, perfectly functioning in the dark. The incredibly massive, completely devastating second artillery salvo absolutely found its perfectly calculated, highly vulnerable wooden mark with terrifying, complete accuracy. The heavily loaded, incredibly massive enemy logistics barge violently shattered into thousands of deeply burning, completely fragmented pieces of useless debris. The highly successful, deeply deadly Allied naval task force had officially scored another incredibly crucial, massively significant tactical victory in the brutal, unrelenting coastal war. However, they intimately knew that the highly enraged, deeply entrenched enemy coastal defense forces would inevitably launch a massive, highly devastating counterattack very soon. The strategic parameters of Operation Sea Dragon rapidly expanded beyond merely hunting small wooden supply vessels hiding along the rugged shoreline. The Allied Naval Command aggressively escalated their destructive maritime campaign, heavily authorizing highly complex shore bombardment missions against deeply entrenched mainland infrastructure. Captain William Sterling meticulously reviewed the highly classified targeting coordinates with his dedicated officers, acutely aware of the massive tactical shift. They were no longer actively pursuing elusive maritime ghosts in the dark. They were preparing to aggressively strike vital enemy transportation arteries, massive steel bridges, and heavily fortified logistical staging areas. Executing these incredibly dangerous shore bombardment operations absolutely required the massive Australian destroyer to navigate perilously close to the heavily defended coastline. The maximum effective range of their twin 5-inch naval cannons dictated an extremely vulnerable tactical position just a few miles offshore. Major Jack Reyes stood tensely beside the heavily armored radar console, calculating the precise ballistic trajectories required to successfully obliterate a major coastal highway intersection. "We must push dangerously close to the 30-fathom curve to actively ensure maximum explosive yield on the primary inland target," the experienced American liaison officer advised quietly. The highly jagged, deeply shadowed mountain ranges towering aggressively over the hostile North Vietnamese coastline concealed a profoundly terrifying, heavily entrenched threat. Highly sophisticated enemy coastal artillery batteries were meticulously camouflaged within deeply excavated cave networks, actively overlooking the exact shallow waters the Allied ships needed to occupy. These heavy defensive guns were specifically positioned to aggressively protect the vital coastal infrastructure from the massive, highly destructive naval bombardments. The incredibly brave Australian crew intimately knew they were willingly sailing their heavily armed warship directly into a highly orchestrated, deeply lethal mainland artillery ambush. As the sleek guided missile destroyer aggressively breached the invisible coastal boundary line, a deeply suffocating tactical silence blanketed the heavy steel bridge. The highly dedicated visual lookouts continuously scanned the distant, densely vegetated cliffs, desperately searching for any subtle, completely unnatural visual anomalies. Captain Sterling heavily gripped the cold brass railing, feeling the massive, deeply powerful vibrations of the ship's engines surging beneath his combat boots. They were officially entering the highly lethal, heavily contested gray zone, where the immense power of the deep ocean violently collided with the entrenched strength of the land. Deep within the highly claustrophobic Combat Information Center, the skilled targeting officers rapidly locked their advanced electronic systems onto the designated inland bridge. The incredibly complex mechanical firing computers continuously whirred and violently clicked, rapidly adjusting the heavy naval gun elevations to precisely compensate for the churning ocean waves. Main battery is completely loaded, highly active, and perfectly locked onto the primary structural target, the chief gunnery officer reported with absolute, icy professional calm. The highly destructive, deeply terrifying mechanical sequence of the impending heavy shore bombardment had officially reached its absolute critical point. Commence massive coastal suppression fire immediately. Unleash the main battery, Captain Sterling commanded, his authoritative voice instantly shattering the oppressive bridge silence. The heavy twin 5-inch cannons erupted with a deafening, incredibly violent mechanical roar that aggressively shook the entire steel vessel to its fundamental core. Massive, highly explosive artillery shells aggressively ripped through the humid tropical air, violently hurling toward the heavily fortified coastal transportation bridge, located miles inland. The highly concentrated, deeply destructive kinetic energy of the advanced Allied warship was actively unleashed upon the deeply entrenched, highly vital enemy logistics infrastructure. Through the highly advanced, heavily magnified optical rangefinders, Major Reyes closely monitored the incredibly violent, highly explosive impact on the distant coastal mainland. Massive, deeply towering plumes of dark gray smoke and violently shattered concrete suddenly erupted exactly where the heavily utilized enemy bridge previously stood. Target is actively taking massive structural damage. Incredibly brilliant shooting from the forward gun mounts, Reyes announced enthusiastically over the heavy tactical intercom system. The highly disciplined Australian gunnery crews meticulously maintained their rapid, deeply punishing rate of fire, successfully transforming the mainland target into completely pulverized debris. However, the deeply entrenched enemy coastal defense forces absolutely refused to remain passive victims during this highly destructive, massively aggressive maritime assault. Completely hidden within the towering, heavily vegetated limestone cliffs, highly trained North Vietnamese artillery crews rapidly calculated the exact firing coordinates of the attacking destroyer. They aggressively utilized the highly visible, incredibly bright muzzle flashes from the Australian warship to perfectly align their heavy, deeply concealed shore-based cannons. The heavily armed, incredibly dangerous coastal mountains were actively preparing to violently strike back at the vulnerable steel intruder aggressively prowling their coastal waters. The very first indication of the impending, highly lethal counterattack was a series of completely terrifying, high-pitched shrieks violently tearing through the sky. Before the deeply startled Australian bridge crew could properly react, 3 massive, highly explosive artillery shells detonated violently in the turbulent ocean nearby. Incredibly massive geysers of violently churning, heavily foaming white water aggressively erupted just 50 yards away from the sleek warship's vulnerable starboard bow. The deeply terrifying, highly chaotic reality of a brutal, close-quarters naval artillery duel had suddenly materialized with absolute, incredibly explosive, deeply deafening, violent fury. We are actively taking highly accurate, deeply concentrated hostile fire from deeply concealed coastal batteries. The bridge lookout screamed with sheer, unadulterated terror. Captain Sterling immediately sprang into deeply decisive tactical action, his highly experienced combat instincts aggressively taking complete, absolute control of the chaotic situation. Hard to port, execute maximum evasive maneuvers immediately, and rapidly bring the main battery to bear on those mountain flashes, he ordered powerfully. The incredibly heavy steel warship violently heeled over, aggressively churning the dark ocean as it desperately attempted to violently dodge the incoming heavy artillery barrage. The heavily camouflaged enemy coastal guns actively continued their relentless, highly accurate bombardment, aggressively filling the airspace around the destroyer with flying steel. The incredibly deafening, violent concussions from the nearby near misses aggressively hammered the thick steel hull, violently throwing several deeply exhausted sailors entirely off balance. Major Reyes quickly grabbed the heavy tactical communication microphone, desperately attempting to rapidly relay the exact enemy artillery coordinates to the Australian gunnery officers. Concentrate all highly explosive counter-battery fire directly on the central mountain ridge. They are heavily tracking our evasive movements perfectly, Reyes shouted intensely. The massive Australian 5-inch guns aggressively pivoted toward the towering coastal cliffs, violently unleashing a rapid, heavily concentrated salvo of highly explosive retaliation. The deeply terrifying, completely chaotic artillery duel rapidly escalated into a highly brutal, deeply unforgiving contest of absolute mechanical precision and sheer luck. The sleek destroyer pitched and rolled violently in the deeply turbulent coastal waters, making highly accurate counter-battery fire incredibly difficult and deeply frustrating. Meanwhile, the completely stationary, deeply entrenched enemy mountain guns aggressively utilized their massive tactical advantage to continuously bracket the desperately maneuvering Allied warship. Shrapnel from a particularly close, highly explosive near miss aggressively shredded the thick steel plating near the deeply exposed forward missile launching system. The incredibly violent, deeply terrifying metallic screech of tearing metal aggressively echoed through the heavily chaotic, completely smoke-filled atmosphere of the open decks. Highly dedicated damage control teams aggressively rushed toward the impacted area, desperately dragging heavy, highly pressurized fire hoses across the violently slipping surface. The deeply terrifying, highly visceral reality of receiving concentrated, heavily destructive enemy fire was an incredibly sobering, profoundly intense experience for the young, deeply dedicated Australian crew. Damage report indicates entirely superficial hull fragmentation. All primary combat systems remain highly functional, the executive officer quickly shouted over the deafening noise. Captain Sterling silently acknowledged the vital tactical update, his intensely focused eyes completely locked onto the heavily flashing enemy artillery positions hidden on shore. He actively knew that maintaining a highly predictable, easily tracked evasive pattern would absolutely result in a catastrophic, deeply fatal direct hit very soon. He aggressively ordered the highly skilled helmsman to execute a series of incredibly erratic, violently sharp tactical turns to actively confuse the enemy gunners. The incredible, deeply violent, mechanical strain, aggressively placed upon the massive steam turbines, was completely immense as the heavy warship violently shifted directions. The deeply dedicated engineers working in the sweltering, highly claustrophobic engine rooms desperately battled to completely maintain maximum, highly critical tactical propulsion power. They continuously monitored the deeply sensitive, heavily pressurized steam lines, intimately knowing that a single, highly catastrophic mechanical failure would absolutely doom them all. The massive, deeply powerful Allied warship was aggressively fighting for its absolute survival in the incredibly dangerous, heavily contested coastal waters of the massive Gulf. Major Reyes continued to meticulously direct the massive, highly explosive Australian counter-battery fire, aggressively utilizing his extensive tactical experience with shore bombardment protocols. Walk the heavy artillery barrage directly up the face of the limestone cliff. Actively suppress those deeply hidden, heavily entrenched cave positions, he commanded. The highly skilled Australian gunnery officers aggressively complied, violently hammering the distant coastal mountainside with a continuous, incredibly destructive stream of massive artillery shells. The incredibly violent, highly explosive impacts aggressively triggered massive, deeply devastating rock slides that violently cascaded down the steep, heavily vegetated cliff faces. Despite the highly concentrated, deeply destructive Allied retaliation, the deeply entrenched North Vietnamese artillery crews aggressively maintained their rapid, highly accurate firing pace. They absolutely possessed a profound, incredibly deep tactical determination to violently protect their vital coastal infrastructure from the massive, heavily armed naval intruders. Another heavily explosive enemy shell detonated with terrifying, absolutely deafening force, just incredibly high above the completely exposed exterior radar mast. The incredibly violent, deeply destructive shockwave forcefully shattered several sensitive communication antennas, actively causing a massive, highly frustrating shower of dangerous electrical sparks to violently rain down. The temporary loss of several highly critical tactical communication channels severely hampered the warship's ability to properly coordinate with the distant Allied fleet. Captain Sterling deeply realized that the deeply dangerous, highly terrifying artillery duel had absolutely reached a critical, highly unsustainable tactical breaking point. We have successfully inflicted massive, deeply severe structural damage upon the primary coastal target. Prepare to execute immediate, highly aggressive tactical withdrawal, Sterling ordered. The sleek, heavily armed Australian destroyer violently carved a massive, deeply foaming wake into the dark ocean as it aggressively turned away from the hostile coast. The heavily camouflaged enemy coastal guns actively fired several final, highly defiant artillery salvos as the massive warship aggressively accelerated toward deeper waters. The incredibly dangerous, deeply explosive shells fell completely harmlessly into the violently churning wake, actively marking the absolute limit of their maximum effective range. The profoundly heavy, deeply terrifying tactical tension, heavily suffocating the dark bridge, rapidly began to slowly dissipate as the massive vessel aggressively reached absolute safety. The exhausted, deeply relieved Australian crew had successfully survived their very first, incredibly brutal encounter with the heavily fortified enemy mainland defenses. Deep within the heavily armored Combat Information Center, Major Reyes slowly wiped the thick, cold sweat from his deeply furrowed, highly exhausted brow. The incredibly intense, highly destructive coastal artillery engagement had explicitly demonstrated the absolute, deeply terrifying lethality of the entrenched enemy defensive capabilities. They are absolutely not going to simply surrender this coastline without extracting a massive, heavily bloody toll from the Allied fleet, Reyes muttered quietly. He intensely respected the profound, undeniably courageous tactical resilience actively displayed by the deeply hidden, entirely unseen enemy artillery crews operating in the dark mountains. Captain Sterling meticulously inspected the highly superficial, completely jagged shrapnel damage, deeply scarring the sleek, pristine gray paint of his massive steel warship. The deeply terrifying, incredibly violent coastal encounter had completely erased any lingering, highly naive illusions regarding the true severity of Operation Sea Dragon. They were actively participating in a massive, deeply brutal, highly unforgiving war of aggressive attrition against a deeply resourceful, heavily dedicated military adversary. The highly dangerous, deeply contested coastal waters heavily demanded absolute, unyielding tactical perfection and profound, incredibly immense physical courage from every single deployed Allied sailor. The heavily armed Australian destroyer aggressively resumed its standard, highly methodical deep-water patrol pattern, actively putting massive distance between itself and the shore. The highly dedicated damage control teams meticulously repaired the violently shattered communication antennas, aggressively restoring absolute, highly vital tactical connectivity with the fleet. The incredibly young, deeply exhausted sailors silently returned to their highly demanding, completely continuous daily shipboard routines, their highly focused minds heavily processing the violence, the deeply terrifying, highly explosive realities of the brutal maritime conflict had completely, permanently altered their deeply ingrained, highly professional military perspectives entirely. As the dark, deeply oppressive tropical evening slowly approached, the massive, violently churning Gulf of Tonkin completely swallowed the heavily fading daylight. The incredibly deadly, highly high-stakes coastal game of cat and mouse would absolutely continue with renewed, highly explosive vigor under the deep darkness. Captain Sterling and Major Reyes stood together on the completely silent, heavily armored bridge, intensely preparing their highly disciplined crew for the next mission. They intimately knew that the highly enraged, deeply entrenched coastal defense forces were aggressively waiting for their inevitable, completely dangerous return to the shallow waters. The incredibly brutal, highly destructive maritime campaign heavily demanded constant, absolutely unwavering combat readiness from the entire, highly dedicated Allied naval strike force. The incredibly powerful, deeply advanced Australian-guided missile destroyer actively remained a massive, heavily armed steel predator, aggressively prowling the highly contested ocean. The incredibly violent, highly explosive artillery duel had completely proven their absolute, undeniable tactical mettle under severe, completely terrifying hostile enemy fire. The deadly, deeply unforgiving coastal war aggressively raged on, actively requiring immense, deeply profound maritime resilience to successfully conquer the heavily fortified, violently contested enemy shoreline. The massive Allied naval task force aggressively returned to the deeply contested coastal waters under the thick, suffocating cover of a moonless night. Operation Sea Dragon heavily demanded a highly coordinated, incredibly dangerous interception mission aimed at a massive enemy logistics convoy recently detected. Captain William Sterling stood resolutely on the darkened bridge, his highly experienced eyes completely adjusted to the profound, deeply terrifying blackness of the turbulent Gulf of Tonkin. The heavily armed Australian destroyer sailed completely silently, maintaining absolute emission control to actively avoid premature detection by the deeply entrenched, highly alert coastal defense networks. Major Jack Reyes closely monitored the highly classified, deeply encrypted tactical frequencies, his face faintly illuminated by the dim red light of the radar console. Highly sophisticated American reconnaissance aircraft flying high above the dark ocean had positively identified dozens of heavily camouflaged wooden supply vessels actively moving southward. This was absolutely not a routine, highly isolated smuggling operation. It was a massive, incredibly vital logistical surge, requiring an immediate, highly destructive maritime response. The incredibly heavy, deeply oppressive tension on the heavily armored bridge rapidly escalated as the sleek warship actively closed the tactical distance. The violently churning, incredibly dark ocean aggressively battered the heavy steel hull of the advancing Australian destroyer, violently throwing freezing sea spray across the exposed forward decks. Captain Sterling aggressively ordered the highly skilled helmsman to carefully maneuver the massive warship dangerously close to the deeply treacherous, heavily jagged coastal reefs. They actively needed to position the highly destructive twin 5-inch naval guns perfectly to completely obliterate the massive enemy maritime convoy before it could successfully scatter. The deeply terrifying, highly dangerous coastal game of deadly hide-and-seek was rapidly approaching its absolutely explosive climax. Without any warning, a highly synchronized series of incredibly brilliant, intensely burning American parachute flares violently burst open high above the deeply shadowed coastline. The harsh, completely unnatural white light aggressively illuminated the dark, turbulent waters, instantly revealing a massive, incredibly terrifying fleet of heavily loaded enemy logistics vessels. They were aggressively hugging the shallow coastal shoals, desperately attempting to secretly transport tons of vital ammunition and heavy military equipment to the southern battlefields. Target is absolutely visually confirmed. Massive maritime convoy is completely exposed. Major Reyes shouted loudly over the incredibly tense, highly charged bridge atmosphere. Before Captain Sterling could aggressively issue the final, highly lethal command to unleash the main battery, the entire dark coastline suddenly erupted in violent fury. It was completely not a disorganized, highly sporadic defensive reaction, but a massive, perfectly orchestrated, heavily coordinated coastal artillery ambush of terrifying proportions. Dozens of deeply concealed, highly sophisticated heavy shore batteries aggressively unmasked their hidden positions simultaneously, violently firing incredibly massive salvos directly at the completely exposed Allied naval formation. The deeply terrifying, highly elusive enemy had actively set a massive, highly lethal maritime trap, and the Allied fleet had walked right in. The incredibly dark, deeply suffocating tropical night sky was instantly completely filled with a terrifying, massive swarm of brightly glowing, highly lethal red tracer rounds. The incredibly deafening, violently concussive roar of the massive enemy coastal artillery barrage actively tore through the heavy, humid air with absolutely terrifying, deeply destructive force. The heavily armed, incredibly powerful Australian-guided missile destroyer was instantly, violently bracketed by dozens of highly explosive, incredibly heavy artillery shells violently detonating in the ocean. Massive, violently towering geysers of deeply foaming whitewater aggressively erupted all around the desperately maneuvering, highly vulnerable steel warship. Execute maximum, highly aggressive, evasive maneuvers immediately. Hard to starboard. Give me absolute flank speed. Captain Sterling roared powerfully over the deafening, highly chaotic noise. The heavily armored, incredibly massive steel vessel violently heeled over, aggressively carving a massive, deeply foaming wake into the dark, turbulent ocean as it desperately dodged the incoming fire. The incredible, deeply violent mechanical strain placed upon the heavy steam turbines was absolutely immense, actively vibrating the entire warship to its fundamental core. They were aggressively fighting for their absolute survival in a deeply terrifying, highly explosive sea of violent, unyielding fire. Despite the incredibly brilliant, highly aggressive tactical ship handling, the sheer, absolutely overwhelming volume of concentrated enemy artillery fire heavily guaranteed a deeply catastrophic impact. A massive, highly explosive enemy shell violently detonated incredibly close to the sleek warship's vulnerable port side, actively showering the upper decks with razor-sharp shrapnel. The deeply terrifying, violently metallic screech of tearing steel aggressively echoed through the chaotic night, instantly followed by the highly agonizing, deeply desperate screams of severely wounded Australian sailors. The horrific, incredibly brutal reality of fierce coastal naval combat had completely arrived with deeply devastating, absolute fury. The incredibly violent, deeply destructive concussive shockwave from the massive near-miss completely destroyed the highly critical, deeply sensitive secondary radar array mounted on the mast. A violently terrifying cascade of highly dangerous electrical sparks and deeply burning, heavily melted wires aggressively rained down upon the chaotic, completely smoke-filled exterior bridge. We have actively lost all secondary electronic targeting capabilities. Primary systems are severely degraded but highly functional, the deeply shaken executive officer frantically reported. Captain Sterling completely ignored the violent chaos. His incredibly focused, highly experienced mind actively, rapidly processing the deeply complex, entirely lethal tactical situation. Highly dedicated, deeply courageous, medical damage control teams aggressively rushed across the violently slipping, completely blood-stained exterior steel decks to actively reach the severely injured sailors. They desperately applied highly pressurized tourniquets and heavy, sterile bandages in the pitch-black darkness, completely ignoring the incredibly massive, highly explosive artillery shells continuously falling nearby. The deeply metallic, heavily pungent stench of fresh human blood aggressively mixed with the highly toxic, deeply suffocating odor of violently burning electrical insulation and explosive cordite. The young, highly disciplined Australian crew actively demonstrated absolutely incredible, profoundly deep physical bravery under terrifyingly heavy hostile fire. Major Reyes frantically gripped the heavy, deeply encrypted tactical radio handset, aggressively coordinating the massive Allied naval response amidst the absolutely terrifying, highly explosive chaos. The entire, heavily armed American destroyer squadron sailing nearby was also actively taking incredibly heavy, highly accurate hostile fire from the deeply entrenched coastal mountains. We desperately need immediate, highly concentrated counter-battery suppression fire directly on those elevated, heavily fortified cliff positions, Reyes aggressively yelled into the heavily static-filled communication network. The incredibly deadly, highly destructive maritime artillery duel had completely escalated into a massive, profoundly terrifying battle for absolute Allied survival. Captain Sterling aggressively ordered the highly skilled Australian gunnery officers to immediately shift all their massive, highly destructive firepower directly toward the violently flashing shoreline. Completely ignore the small logistics boats for now. Absolutely concentrate the entire main battery directly on those heavy coastal artillery emplacements, Sterling commanded forcefully. The massive, deeply powerful twin 5-inch naval cannons instantly pivoted, violently unleashing a rapid, incredibly continuous stream of highly explosive retaliation directly into the dark, heavily vegetated mountains. The incredibly deadly, completely unforgiving mechanical rhythm of absolute maritime destruction actively aggressively resumed amidst the terrifying, highly explosive chaos. The incredibly violent, deeply deafening roar of the massive Australian naval guns aggressively answered the terrifying, highly continuous enemy coastal artillery barrage with absolute fury. It was a deeply terrifying, completely brutal heavyweight boxing match actively fought between a rapidly moving, highly vulnerable steel warship and completely stationary, deeply entrenched mountain fortresses. The highly explosive, incredibly massive Australian artillery shells aggressively ripped through the humid tropical night, violently detonating with absolutely terrifying, deeply devastating force against the rocky cliffs. The incredibly chaotic, highly explosive sea of fire completely illuminated the deeply dark, violently churning Gulf of Tonkin. The sleek, heavily armed Australian guided missile destroyer actively performed a highly spectacular, incredibly dangerous series of deeply aggressive, evasive tactical maneuvers in the darkness. Captain Sterling expertly anticipated the highly complex, deeply mathematical firing patterns of the heavily entrenched enemy gunners, actively altering the massive ship's course constantly. The incredibly heavy steel bow aggressively smashed through the massive, deeply violent ocean swells, violently hurling freezing, incredibly corrosive salt water completely over the heavily smoking forward gun turrets. The incredibly brilliant, highly masterful ship handling actively prevented the deeply vulnerable vessel from absorbing a highly fatal, completely direct hit. Deep inside the incredibly cramped, heavily armored 5-inch gun turrets, the highly dedicated Australian loading crews aggressively worked in absolutely terrifying, deeply suffocating heat conditions. The incredibly massive, highly complex mechanical loading systems continuously whirred and violently slammed, aggressively ramming the heavy, highly explosive projectiles directly into the smoking breaches. The young, completely exhausted sailors were heavily drenched in thick sweat, their highly strained muscles actively burning as they desperately maintained the incredibly rapid, highly critical rate of fire. They intimately knew that the absolute survival of their entire ship completely depended upon their incredible, deeply unyielding physical endurance. The massive, heavily armed American warships operating nearby aggressively joined the deeply terrifying, highly explosive counter-battery artillery duel, violently unleashing their own incredibly massive firepower. The dark, deeply suffocating tropical night sky was completely crisscrossed by hundreds of highly lethal, brightly glowing tracer rounds and incredibly massive, deeply terrifying artillery shells. The incredibly coordinated, highly destructive Allied naval barrage actively began to heavily suppress the deeply entrenched, highly camouflaged enemy coastal artillery batteries hidden in the dark mountains. The deeply terrifying, highly explosive balance of absolute maritime power slowly began to aggressively shift back toward the heavily battered fleet. Suddenly, an incredibly massive, profoundly terrifying secondary explosion aggressively erupted high up on the densely vegetated, deeply shadowed slopes of the heavily contested coastal cliffs. One of the highly explosive, deeply accurate Allied naval artillery shells had actively achieved a completely catastrophic, highly spectacular direct hit on a massive enemy ammunition dump. A violently brilliant, incredibly towering fireball aggressively ripped completely through the deeply dark tropical night, aggressively showering the surrounding coastal mountainside with violently burning, highly destructive debris. The incredibly heavy, deeply continuous rate of hostile enemy artillery fire instantly, noticeably began to heavily slacken and decrease. Taking absolute, highly aggressive tactical advantage of the deeply sudden, highly critical reduction in incoming hostile fire, Captain Sterling instantly refocused his massive, destructive weapons. Aggressively shift the main battery fire back directly onto the highly vulnerable, completely exposed enemy maritime logistics convoy immediately. He ordered with deeply icy, absolute precision. The massive, deeply powerful naval guns aggressively re-engaged the tiny, highly desperate wooden supply vessels actively caught completely helpless within the deeply terrifying, highly explosive crossfire. The incredibly brutal, deeply unyielding maritime interdiction mission was aggressively resumed despite the heavily sustained, deeply chaotic structural damage successfully taken. The heavily loaded, deeply camouflaged enemy logistics boats were completely obliterated by the incredibly accurate, highly explosive Australian naval artillery salvos, violently impacting the shallow waters. Massive, violently towering columns of deeply foaming seawater and heavily burning, completely shattered wooden debris aggressively marked the absolute, terrifying destruction of the vital convoy. The incredibly deadly, highly intense climax of the brutal, deeply terrifying night ambush had officially been successfully reached, absolutely transforming the dark ocean into a true sea of fire. The incredibly brave, highly disciplined Allied naval strike force had aggressively held the desperately contested, highly dangerous maritime line. As the intensely chaotic, highly explosive tropical night slowly wore on, the deeply entrenched, heavily damaged enemy coastal batteries entirely ceased their highly aggressive artillery fire. The incredibly brutal, deeply devastating Allied naval bombardment had successfully, completely silenced the highly dangerous, deeply hidden mainland mountain fortresses with absolute, deeply terrifying lethal efficiency. The incredibly deafening, completely violent roar of massive combat was rapidly replaced by the deeply heavy, highly rhythmic mechanical thrumming of the heavily exhausted Australian warship's powerful engines. The deeply terrified, completely exhausted bridge crew heavily permitted themselves a deeply profound, highly collective sigh of absolute relief. Captain Sterling and Major Reyes stood completely silently on the heavily damaged, deeply smoking exterior bridge, meticulously assessing their heavily battered but proudly floating steel warship. The deeply terrifying, highly explosive coastal ambush had exacted a heavy, deeply bloody toll, yet the incredible, highly disciplined Australian crew remained completely, absolutely unbroken. They had successfully navigated the incredibly dangerous, completely deadly sea of fire, actively proving their immense, undeniably profound tactical resilience against an incredibly resourceful, heavily armed mainland enemy. The brutal, highly unforgiving maritime realities of Operation Sea Dragon had officially reached their absolutely terrifying, profoundly explosive peak. The pale, gray light of early dawn finally began to slowly pierce the thick, heavy smoke, lingering heavily over the turbulent Gulf of Tonkin. The violently contested, incredibly dangerous coastal waters gradually transformed from a pitch-black nightmare into a deeply somber, highly revealing morning reality. Captain William Sterling stood firmly on the severely battered, deeply scarred exterior bridge of his heavy Australian destroyer. The sleek, heavily armed steel warship slowly carved a massive, heavily foaming wake into the dark ocean, aggressively withdrawing toward the absolute safety of the designated deepwater staging area far offshore. The incredibly deafening, completely violent roar of the massive naval artillery duel had finally been entirely replaced by the heavy, deeply rhythmic thrumming of the powerful steam turbines. The deeply terrifying, highly explosive night ambush was completely over, but the horrific, undeniable physical evidence of the brutal coastal combat remained violently etched into the ship. Major Jack Reyes slowly lowered his heavy binoculars, carefully scanning the deeply jagged, incredibly hostile North Vietnamese shoreline rapidly fading into the thick morning mist. The deeply entrenched, highly camouflaged enemy coastal artillery batteries had entirely ceased their aggressive, lethal fire. Sterling and Reyes meticulously commenced a highly detailed, deeply sobering visual inspection of the massive structural damage inflicted upon the heavily armored Australian warship. The previously pristine, perfectly painted gray steel hull was now deeply, violently pockmarked with hundreds of jagged, completely terrifying shrapnel scars from the massive near misses. The highly critical, incredibly sensitive secondary radar array was entirely reduced to a completely melted, violently shattered pile of useless metallic debris resting heavily on the deck. The incredibly violent, highly explosive reality of the deeply brutal maritime conflict was absolutely undeniable and completely terrifying to witness. Deep below the heavily scarred exterior decks, the highly dedicated Australian medical teams worked tirelessly within the brightly lit, highly sterile confines of the ship's emergency ward. The severely wounded, deeply exhausted young sailors received highly critical, life-saving surgical treatments for the horrific, jagged shrapnel injuries sustained during the violent artillery barrage. The deeply pungent, highly metallic smell of fresh blood actively mixed with the strong, incredibly clinical odor of heavy medical antiseptics and sterile bandages. Despite the horrific physical pain, the incredibly brave, highly disciplined men absolutely refused to voice any loud complaints or regrets. Captain Sterling intensely reflected upon the profound, highly shocking ferocity of the massive enemy coastal defense forces they had aggressively encountered in the dark. The deeply entrenched, entirely unseen North Vietnamese artillery crews were absolutely not merely passive, highly vulnerable victims, passively waiting for the massive Allied naval bombardments. They were incredibly resourceful, deeply highly motivated, and absolutely prepared to violently strike back at the heavily armed intruders with massive, completely terrifying, heavily concentrated firepower. The deeply dangerous, incredibly brutal coastal war was actively proven to be a highly lethal, completely two-sided heavyweight maritime brawl. Major Reyes successfully utilized the heavily repaired, highly encrypted primary communication console to actively re-establish vital tactical contact with the massive American 7th Fleet Command. We are entirely clear of the highly contested coastal engagement zone, proceeding directly to the designated deepwater rally coordinates at absolute maximum tactical speed, Reyes reported firmly. The distant American admiral immediately acknowledged the highly critical tactical transmission, aggressively praising the completely incredible, deeply unyielding bravery actively demonstrated by the Allied Australian crew. The massive, deeply coordinated international naval alliance had successfully, violently survived a completely horrific, highly explosive trial. The incredibly harsh, deeply unforgiving strategic realities of Operation Sea Dragon were finally completely settling heavily upon the deeply exhausted, heavily traumatized bridge officers. This massive, highly destructive maritime campaign would absolutely never be won through a single, incredibly decisive naval battle fought in the deep, open ocean waters. It was completely designed to be a massive, deeply agonizing war of aggressive attrition, actively requiring constant, incredibly intense vigilance and absolute physical endurance. The deeply elusive, highly dedicated enemy logistics networks would absolutely require continuous, highly dangerous coastal patrols to remain completely, effectively severed permanently. Highly skilled Australian engineering and damage control crews immediately began actively initiating critical, highly necessary emergency shipboard repairs while perfectly maintaining maximum tactical speed. They aggressively utilized heavy, incredibly bright welding torches to violently seal the deeply jagged, highly dangerous shrapnel holes completely piercing the upper steel superstructures. The completely shattered, heavily melted electrical communication cables were rapidly bypassed and meticulously reconnected by the deeply exhausted, incredibly dedicated technical specialists. The heavily battered, deeply scarred steel warship was slowly, aggressively being brought completely back to absolute, maximum combat readiness despite the horrific, violent nighttime damage. Captain Sterling approached the highly exhausted American liaison officer, firmly offering a deeply respectful, highly professional handshake amidst the heavily smoking, completely chaotic bridge wreckage. Your highly accurate, deeply critical tactical counter-battery coordination absolutely saved this entire warship from sustaining a completely fatal, incredibly catastrophic direct hit tonight. Major, Sterling stated sincerely. Reyes firmly gripped the Australian commander's hand. his deeply tired eyes perfectly reflecting a profound, incredibly intense mutual respect, actively forged within the violent crucible. Your highly disciplined, incredibly brave crew performed with absolute, completely terrifying perfection under incredibly heavy fire, Captain, Reyes replied. As the highly battered Australian destroyer aggressively pushed further out into the completely safe, deeply rolling blue waters of the incredibly massive Gulf of Tonkin, the horizon changed. The incredibly terrifying, deeply hostile coastal mountains were rapidly replaced by the highly comforting, absolutely massive silhouettes of the heavily armed American carrier strike group. Dozens of incredibly powerful, deeply advanced Allied warships sailed perfectly together in highly tight, incredibly disciplined tactical formations across the vast ocean. It was a completely awe-inspiring, profoundly massive symbol of absolutely overwhelming, heavily challenged, deeply determined international maritime military power. The immense psychological impact of the deeply terrifying, incredibly violent coastal artillery duel was intensely visible upon the completely exhausted faces of the young crew. The incredibly youthful, highly naive sailors who had aggressively sailed into the dark, heavily contested coastal waters had completely, absolutely vanished during the violent night. They had been aggressively transformed into deeply hardened, highly experienced combat veterans, entirely shaped by the terrifying, highly explosive realities of brutal naval warfare. Their perfectly innocent, highly romanticized civilian perspectives were entirely replaced by a cold, deeply necessary, incredibly absolute military focus on simple survival. The incredibly beautiful, highly vibrant tropical morning sun completely broke through the heavy, dark rain clouds, aggressively casting a warm, highly comforting golden light. This perfectly serene, incredibly peaceful natural weather deeply contrasted with the absolutely horrific, highly violent mechanical destruction that had entirely consumed the previous dark hours. The incredibly vast, deeply indifferent ocean actively absorbed the completely terrifying, highly explosive human violence without displaying a single, lasting, visible scar on its rolling surface. The deeply tragic, highly complex military conflict seemed incredibly small and completely insignificant when directly compared to the absolutely massive, uncaring natural environment. Despite the horrific, deeply terrifying structural damage and the highly tragic, completely undeniable human casualties successfully taken, the aggressive maritime mission was an absolute success. The deeply hidden, heavily loaded enemy logistics convoy had been completely, utterly obliterated by the incredibly accurate, highly explosive Australian naval artillery bombardments. Tons of highly critical, deeply dangerous enemy ammunition and vital military supplies were permanently, absolutely resting at the dark bottom of the massive Gulf of Tonkin. The highly dedicated Allied Naval Task Force had successfully, violently executed their deeply complex, highly dangerous strategic tactical orders with complete, deadly efficiency. The highly complex, deeply clinical military cost-benefit analysis of the brutal, highly violent night ambush heavily favored the incredibly powerful, highly advanced Allied naval forces, while aggressively risking a completely massive, multi-million-dollar guided missile destroyer to violently hunt tiny wooden supply boats initially seemed highly disproportionate. The ultimate cargo mattered. Actively preventing those incredibly massive, highly dangerous explosive munitions from successfully reaching the intense southern land, battles completely saved countless Allied infantry lives. The incredibly heavy, deeply terrifying tactical risks actively taken on the dark ocean were absolutely, undeniably justified by the massive strategic military rewards. However, Captain Sterling intimately understood that this highly successful, incredibly destructive maritime victory was merely a highly temporary, deeply fleeting tactical disruption of the enemy. The deeply resourceful, heavily dedicated North Vietnamese logistics commanders would absolutely order the rapid, highly secretive construction of countless new, deeply camouflaged wooden supply boats. The deeply terrifying, highly dangerous maritime cycle of aggressive coastal infiltration and incredibly violent, heavily explosive naval interception would absolutely inevitably continue without pause. The highly exhausted, deeply disciplined Allied warships would absolutely be heavily forced to violently return to the dark, incredibly dangerous, shallow waters repeatedly. The completely undeniable, highly profound historical significance of the Australian naval contribution to the massive, heavily American-led maritime conflict was deeply cementing itself into reality. The highly professional, incredibly dedicated Royal Australian Navy had actively proven its absolute, completely terrifying combat capabilities on a deeply complex, highly visible global stage. They actively stood completely shoulder to shoulder with the massive, incredibly powerful United States 7th Fleet, aggressively fighting and violently bleeding in the deeply contested waters. This incredibly powerful, deeply unified international maritime alliance actively projected an absolute, highly unbreakable wall of incredibly heavy steel. Captain Sterling slowly depressed the heavy metallic button on the highly secure, heavily repaired shipwide tactical public address system to address his completely exhausted men. You have actively faced incredibly terrifying, highly concentrated hostile enemy fire with absolute, deeply unyielding physical bravery and perfect, completely flawless professional military discipline, he announced proudly. Your incredibly dedicated, highly aggressive tactical actions during the dark night absolutely guaranteed the completely safe, highly successful survival of this heavily damaged steel warship. The deeply tired, heavily battered Australian sailors completely stopped their rigorous damage control duties to silently, deeply, proudly listen. The incredibly demanding, highly grueling physical preparations for the absolutely inevitable, highly dangerous next coastal combat patrol completely commenced without a single moment of delay. The highly specialized, deeply exhausted gunnery crews meticulously began actively replenishing the incredibly massive, highly depleted explosive ammunition magazines located deep within the heavy hull. The heavily blood-stained, completely debris-covered exterior steel decks were aggressively scrubbed entirely clean, violently washing the horrific, deeply terrifying physical remnants of violent combat into the ocean. The massive, deeply powerful Australian warship was actively, aggressively sharpening its incredibly heavy steel claws for the next brutal fight. Major Reyes stood quietly on the heavily damaged, deeply scorched exterior bridge wing, completely staring back at the highly distant, deeply fading enemy coastal mountains. He held a profound, incredibly deep tactical respect for the completely unseen, highly dedicated North Vietnamese artillery gunners actively hiding in those incredibly dark, heavily vegetated caves. They had actively fought back with absolute, incredibly terrifying ferocity, completely refusing to completely yield their highly vital coastal waters to the massive Allied naval armada. The incredibly brutal, deeply unforgiving maritime war aggressively demanded absolute, completely total commitment from both highly dedicated opposing sides. The beautifully pale, perfectly serene morning light completely illuminated the heavily scarred, deeply battered gray hull of the incredibly massive Australian guided missile destroyer. Despite the incredibly terrifying, highly explosive structural damage actively sustained during the brutal night ambush, the deeply powerful warship remained absolutely, completely unbowed and unbroken. The incredibly unyielding dawn of incredibly heavy steel perfectly symbolized the absolute, deeply resolute determination of the highly dedicated, incredibly brave Allied naval forces. They would completely continue to aggressively sail directly into the deeply terrifying, completely violent sea of fire until the brutal maritime war ended.